Hello, and welcome to Chatty AF, the Anime Feminist podcast. I'm Tony, a contributing editor here at AniFem. You can find me on Twitter at PoetPedagogue. And with me today are the Black manga critic and Mo. If you would mind introducing yourselves.
Hello. I'm MoBlack. Um, I when I do things, I do usually longer like anime criticisms and analysis. Um, I oh I got a domain recently. It's very fun. I'm very proud of it. I got a server, so if you go to moblack.xyz, you'll find everything that I do and all the links and stuff. But yeah, I'm just happy to be here. I admire Anifem quite a lot. When I was starting doing this and like looking for like any type of any type of source that like sort of makes sense on how they look at anime, especially like how they look at fan service and like other hot button topics when anime discourse goes down. I was really happy that Anifem was there, like making sense. So I'm very happy to be here.
Um, I am the Black manga critic. Most people, just call me BMC for short because that's like, just like a lot to say every time you want to, uh, talk to me like by name or call me by name. So BMC for short. I have a Twitter that I'm on fairly frequently. I have a YouTube channel that I have not been on for a while, but usually I do like manga reactions. I try to vary, the types of manga that I'm reading when it comes to those reactions. On and every now and then in the past, like I would do like, just have like maybe uh, ramblings. I call them ramblings, where I just kind of go into, my ideas on abolition, anime, anti-blackness, um, the state, socialism, anarchy, that kind of stuff. So feel free to check out what's there. I hope at some point that I can come back and um, do my YouTube work in more frequent capacity, but definitely feel free to follow me on Twitter at the Manga Scholar. Uh, where I definitely talk about like abolition, anti-blackness, anime, manga, and I think education too, because I do teach, so that's really important to me as well.
Great. All right. So, we are super happy to have you both here. Today, we're going to be talking about abolitionism, which is a political movement that has gained a lot of prominence over the last few years, especially since the death of George Floyd, that I personally feel has a huge amount of like poignancy when we're talking about anime and can help us understand anime, and anime can also help us understand it. So to just kind of give us a very basic definition of abolitionism, the abolitionist movement, we're just going to go through a few of the key tenets of abolitionism to begin. The first tenet of abolitionism, we're going to be talking about is that abolitionism is about, at its heart, the full abolition of police and prisons. So that means that there is no more police and prisons. This is not community policing. This is not um, nicer, prettier prisons. This is there are no prisons, there are no police. That is and the reason that we have that demand is because abolitionists believe that reducing the power of death-making institutions, as Bruce Olson Gilmore puts it, such as police and prisons, and investing money, time, energy into life-making institutions that can, uh, such as schools, such as services for people, such as the various things that keep people safe, healthy, happy, um, and police and prisons fundamentally do not do that.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me because I got it. I started transforming my politics around like late 2019, early 2020. Um, and so like I consider myself an abolitionist, but like I didn't really like start studying it until after the death of George Floyd. It really made me like think about like what is it that our system is doing, and when you're talking about like how like relatively simple like abolition is for the abolition of police and prisons, it just reminds me of all the discourse of around like defund the police and how people were like, well, defund the police is actually it's a very complicated thing. You see, we actually want to increase it a little bit. So the slogan is confused. I was like, no, it's
No, we
exactly
don't.
what it says. We want we want the thing that it says. We're saying the thing because that's what we want.
No, we are not asking for police reform. We are asking for police to be gone.
What do you mean by that?
Okay. Anyway, do we want to transition into the next one?
Yes. So the next tenet that we'll use just for this conversation would be the transformation or abolition of the state. This one is definitely so. Police abolition, prison abolition are long-term projects. Abolition of the entire state is probably an even longer-term project. But it's essentially saying that if we can deal with punishment, dangerous behavior, abuse in a way that does not militarize people and does not violate people's rights, then we can also like take care of ourselves and do the things that we think we need the state to do, in a way that uh, focuses on like collaboration and like willing participation of communities and not coercion um, and not violence, not these things. We sort of recognize that the existence of the state, I mean, the existence of the police and the existence of prisons are there because we need the state to continue to exist, right? Um, and so by recognizing that, we can try and make a world in which eventually none of these things are necessary.
Yes, and I want to add on to this is a complicated matter. There's a reason it's transformation or abolition of the state because there's a lot of debate among abolitionists who are some of whom are more socialist and who believe in a socialist state, right?
Hmm.
But still somehow abolishing police and prisons. I'm not quite sure how, but that's what they believe. And people who are more anarchist and who believe in what Jasbir Puar calls a no state solution, right?
Right.
So it's not. There's a lot of debate in abolitionist circles around this. Moving on, the third kind of thing we're going to be talking about, and this might not actually be the order we discuss in the episode, but that's fine, is transformative justice and centering survivors to create spaces for actual accountability and refusing organized abandonment. So many people think that abolitionism is like naive, that it's not about like actually, protecting people. But in reality, it's abolitionist movements have long been spearheaded and organized by and theorized by survivors of extreme violence who realized that the police and prisons were just not working to actually protect them. We're not working to create any space for accountability. We're not working to actually like support them through the aftermath of that violence. So how do we actually um, lean into that struggle for accountability in a way that creates meaningful support for survivors and does not abandon them in their most dire circumstances.
Hmm.
Um, and that's the work of transformative justice, a mode of justice that is like different from punitive justice in that it's about transforming the circumstances that produce harm and not about just locking up the person who did it. Although, some amount of punishment is still, a question in that matter. All right. And Danny, you got the last one?
Yeah, of course. I just want to say centering survivors is, I think, really important, especially in like conveying the goals of abolition, because if you think about, for example, people who have never had to call the police before and who have never had to interact with it will constantly say like, without the police, who will you call when you're attacked? Who will you call when this? Who will you call when that? But if you listen to the people who have been attacked, sexually abused, robbed, whatever, they will say, yeah, I called the police. They didn't do anything. They thought I did it, which happens a lot. They took down my name and then they left. and then nothing ever came of it ever again. So there's a huge difference between people who have never had to interact with these systems, but who have bought the idea that they're necessary in case one day something happens, and the people who have actually been a victim of something horrible and who have realized that these systems are there not to help them, but to just uphold the state and uphold like power.
Okay, so that kind of dovetails into the last tenet, and I think, and this is not to say that this tenet is like the most important tenet or anything like that. It's more to say that dismantling anti-blackness, imperialism, and settler colonialism, in particular, dismantling anti-blackness is like paramount to any sort of work towards abolitionism, any work towards abolition of the police, of prisons, of the state. And I think going back to what Tony stated about, abolitionists having different ideas of what abolition looks like, or how do we get to abolition, or what the world will look like after abolition. None of these things can, to me, be seriously discussed without discussing anti-blackness. In particular, right? Obviously, imperialism, settler colonialism. I think most abolitionists are, for the most part, on the same page with those two things. But I think anti-blackness is where we really get to these like divides and these departures from where abolition sort of starts and where it can take us. If we think about anti-blackness as sort of foundational to the logics of like the world as it exists, right? We can think about economic logics, carceral logics, all of these, right? Gender logics. Then we can really, I think, truly begin to think about what abolition could be, what needs to happen to get there, and what would happen after the fact. And just really quickly to kind of say some things, right? When we think about imperialism, right, anti-blackness as foundational to imperialism, thinking about chattel slavery, thinking about the ways in which slavery has quite literally, right, and in some ways figuratively built the logics of the world in which we live in which we move through. And if we think about settler colonialism, the ways in which we obviously have to have conversations about borders, about Israeli Palestinian interactions in particular, right? Israeli violent Israeli interactions or acts against Palestinians, but also to think about the ways in which anti-blackness functions within those interactions. I was going to say something about Israel as sort of like, a byproduct of imperialism and thus a byproduct of anti-blackness, but I'm not going to get into that because that's a lot. So maybe that does come up, but maybe not for this podcast.
It's
Oh,
a cool
absolutely
thing.
will come up. Like, I'm going to be talking about later on. I'll be talking. We can edit this part out, but later on I'll be talking about Jasbir Puar and like her idea of the no state solution as and like critiquing kind of like the way of looking at like the Israel-Palestine conflict. So I'm excited to go there. But yeah, no, we will go there. So yeah, thank you all for describing these different aspects of it. The reason we're talking about this in anime is that there's so many anime lately that and historically that have dealt with questions of incarceration, of revolutionary change, of the ways that survivors are treated. To give you an idea, we're going to be talking about things like Woman Called Fujiko Mine, JoJo's Stone Ocean, Decadence, Michiko and Hachin, Akudama Drive. There's so many that an abolitionist lens really clarifies. So we hope that this episode will expand your thinking and clarify some of the questions these shows present, and also open up new questions, so that when you're watching your next anime, you think to yourself, why is this depicted like that? Before we begin, I wanted to ask if we can just, briefly talk a bit about how each of us came to abolitionism as a political philosophy, since it is such a radical departure from the kind of status quo or mainstream philosophies of American political life. But also, I think, a very logical response to these situations we find ourselves in. So, yeah. Would anyone of you like to get us started?
I guess I'll probably be the shortest since I mentioned it a bit. Like I had, like I said, like a pretty big political realignment around 2019. Actually, when I started writing about anime. Wow, that's longer ago than I want to admit. Anyway, no big deal. NBD, as they say. But yeah, I think what sort of did it for me is like I consider myself privileged. I had a pretty good childhood. I luckily didn't really have to interact with the police that much. I went to a really good university, but even then, I couldn't stop thinking about like how is it that even with all that, like the world in general still feels like it's like coming apart just slowly. Um, why are we not addressing things like climate change? Why is it that like every year or so, um, like a police officer can just shoot an unarmed black man and then we just like go on like it's fine? Like, how is imperialism still happening? How is the United States still involved in like six different like wars simultaneously when like nobody wants them, right? And I guess for me, if you think through it and you read philosophers and economists that have answers to this, like the the framework that makes more sense is to me an abolitionist framework, um, and I really started exploring. Like I started looking even at like some examples of my own life. Um, of For example, when I was in university, it was basically common knowledge that like all the black students there would like always have their university cards at all times, because if you were stopped by a cop, you wanted evidence. You wanted to give evidence to the cop to treat you like a human being and not like a black person. um,
Mm.
or uh, doing even doing stuff like that I was lucky to do, like study abroad and like finding anti-blackness abroad, and definitely being treated differently than like the other students that were in the program. Um, it You can't like go through these things, and in my opinion, it would be very difficult to go through these things and not think about like why it is that the world can't be any different.
Yeah, I think yeah, I'll say there are three very like particular moments that really kind of like catapulted me into uh you know thinking about abolition, like conversing about it, reading about it, all of that. Um and trying to implement that in my like, it's like my daily life, like work, things like that. The first instance I would say was in 2014. So this is like my last year of undergrad. I was about to start my PhD program, and I was in this program at Rutgers University, where we it was like all um, uh, black students, students of color, like other students of color, and all of our projects were discussing different really really like important topics, gender, um blackness, things like that. I was studying feminism, but anyways, there was a conversation that we had just about like kind of what it meant to um really like what it meant to be like a student of color, what it meant to be black, you know and just kind of like that was like a really like big moment for me, because it kind of allowed me to like be open in a way that I didn't feel like I could be about that particular topic, about blackness, about moving through this world as a black person. And I think after that, like moving into my PhD program, so I was there for like 2.5 years, but moving into that, there were just more instances to discuss anti-blackness, discuss abolition, discuss all the research that and all the scholars that discuss that. I was doing a fellowship program where we had mentored undergraduate students, and there was one undergraduate student in that program. This is at CUNY, by the way, the City University of New York. So I was at the Graduate Center, and this one student was doing like organizing work. He was, very heavily like involved in doing like organizing work. I can't remember what org he worked for, but he was doing that. And we had gotten into like a discussion about, Obama and the election and all of that. So that was around 2017, and that was really like kind of like my like, okay, like if I'm gonna be in this, I'm gonna be in this, because he was just so eloquent about like and knowledgeable about the ways in which Obama was an agent of the state, how just like very like representational politics. So that was really like my kind of way of like really getting into it and really like looking into it and being honest with myself about the ways in which I was kind of doing similar work. And then the third was, of course, George Floyd. So that was kind of like, all right, yeah, I was in it, but now it's like, let's go, like, let's really, really get to work. Let's like talk about this daily. Let's like do this work daily. Let's really be in conversation and community with people. And I would say that was really like kind of like those three things I would say were really foundational to like my entryway into abolition and thinking about prisons, police, anti-blackness, all together. Yeah.
The moment of George Floyd's murder, I think, was the moment when abolitionist thought finally was able to pierce a little bit of the mainstream political discourse, where we saw, for example, Miriam Kaba come out with that essay in the New York Times that was like, yes, I actually want to fully abolish the police. That means no more police, right? And of course I'm guessing they probably gussied up the headline to be a little bit more inflammatory. But also she said that, she meant what she said, and she did not leave any crumbs. For me, right, like I originally was introduced to abolitionism in undergrad through, as I'm sure a lot of people are, Angela Davis's work, specifically her book Are Prisons Obsolete? And I read it in undergrad, as a young 20-year-old. I was like, what is this? What's going on here? Why aren't you talking about alternatives? Which is not really the project of that book, it must be said. The project of the book is to explain why prisons are death-making institutions that, don't actually serve any meaningful purpose other than harming people and producing capital.
Right.
But I was skeptical at the time. And then I think what really changed it up for me was moving to New York City, and seeing as a teacher, right? I've worked in predominantly Black schools most of the time that I've been a teacher in New York City, and and also just being in community with Black residents in New York City, and kind of seeing the city through that perspective of trying to understand all the ways these institutional forces conspire to like make my job as a teacher impossible, in terms of like, instead of being a teacher, I realized, wait, I'm not becoming a teacher in these classrooms, I'm becoming a cop. Oh, and recognizing that confluence between education and incarceration, and like how Black children are treated as leading criminals, like really radicalized me. And as I was, experiencing that, I was also reading Saidiya Hartman's work, which really is the foundation for my thinking around this. She wrote this wonderful book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, that's all about queer Black women at the turn of the century trying to live their lives free from enclosure. And he discusses these reformatories, right? Like, and we're going to get more into that as we talk about JoJo's, so I'm not going to get super into that right now. But as I was doing all that stuff, I was also watching Madoka Magica. And if you haven't read it yet, I have an article out about Madoka and my path to becoming an abolitionist.
No, I said definitely read it. It's like awesome. It's like fantastic.
I actually had both Mo and Danny read it as I was like preparing to publish it.
Yeah, so we can confirm that it's such an awesome article.
And like for me, I saw reflected in Madoka my experience of like how, and so anime actually became this really important tool for me to understand what abolitionism really means. Because I saw so much of the things that I was thinking said out loud in these anime, and I was like, oh, I really do credit Angela Davis like for being that kind of the first kind of entry point that so many of us have into abolitionist thought, which brings us to kind of like discussing the first tenet of like abolitionism that I want to get into, which is full abolition of police and prisons, right? Yeah. Do we want to talk a little bit about like Angela Davis's intervention and like why that's important, and then we're gonna get into like how that relates to anime? Angela Davis's Our Prison Obsolete was a text that I think is many people's first introduction to abolitionist thought. So it was actually published fairly recently. It was published in 2003. But it was really the culmination of decades of work that Angela Davis had done with her organization, Critical Resistance, to um, investigate all the ways that the growth of prison systems was exploiting and harming Black communities, and like how the prison industrial complex was forming. And it's a really important text in abolitionism. So yeah, I wanted to give us an opportunity to talk about like how it influenced us, and then we can, or why it's important intervention, and then we'll go into like how it, it helps clarify some of these anime.
What that text really helped me do is to like put into context like the whole idea of like modern prisons, right? Because it wasn't always the case that we think of it natural today that like you do something bad, you go to jail, right? And like how else would you do it? And the fact is, it wasn't always the case, especially in the United States, that we had like these like massive prisons, right? Where we just like kept anyone who like looked at anyone the wrong way, right? Angela Davis's text really goes through the history of how like incarceration is basically a byproduct of the Confederates losing the Civil War. A lot of old plantations became prisons, um, and the racial makeup, especially of those prisons, was radically transformed when when slavery was abolished. Except, of course, as we all know, um, as a punishment for a crime, right? Looking at that history and realizing that we've basically just inherited the legacy of like racial like chattel slavery under the guise of like keeping people safe. It just makes you realize like if there was a time where we didn't need this, there can be a time in the future where we don't need it again. And I feel like that like mental block is sort of like the first step. It was a good step for me to take. I think it would be a good first step for a lot of listeners who are maybe still unsure about this stuff.
Yeah. I also think um, that one thing Davis's text does really well is not only just sort of situate PSC abolition, prison industrial complex abolition historically, but it also, I think the best sort of scholars do that. The language is really accessible, and there's one instance in the text in which Davis sort of talks about people taking prisons for granted, right? And I think that language is so important because usually when we're taught about taking certain things for granted, we're talking about good things, things that are beneficial to us, things that are that improve our daily livelihood. And two things are kind of happening there, right? I think the first thing is that Davis is kind of signaling that we see prisons as a good thing, as an objectively good thing. And so so we're like, oh man, so in the ways that nor I think people who are or pro prisons, they're like, oh, prisons are great, like we need prisons, these are awesome, like, oh my god, I can't believe, like, you know like sometimes, we should think more about prisons and more about how prisons are good, right? And taking prisons for granted. And then on the flip side, number two is that we, right, like prisons are just like, at least in my sense, like objectively like awful death dealing institutions. But even with that, like we still view prisons maybe even like subconsciously, right, on a particular like maybe psychoanalytic. If we think about it psychoanalytically, we think about it as like something that has to exist, something that is objectively like necessary part of our daily livelihood. And Davis is sort of saying like, well, no, like this shouldn't be here. Like this should not be something that we take for granted. We have to like eliminate it, right? We have to abolish it. Hence, abolition, right? And prison abolition. Yeah. So I think the language like is also really useful as like someone who's like just kind of jumping into abolition and this idea of abolitionism and PIC abolition, prison industrial complex abolition. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it clarifies, when we're looking at, like, you talked about like the psychoanalytic aspect of it, right? We can also look at it as an aspect of the collective imagination or the collective unconscious, right?
Yes.
How anime shows us kind of the collective unconscious well, I guess Japan, but but that also informs our collective unconscious because Lord knows so many of us grow up watching anime, and that informs our idea of what constitutes safety, what constitutes you know how we we treat cops, right? Which I think brings us to the topic of like a lot of anime is just kind of propaganda. It's and like not even really subtle about it, but yeah. What example do we want to talk about first?
Maybe we could switch it up and start with Death Note because I think Death Note
Oof,
is
yeah.
uh,
Oh my god.
everyone knows Death Note, and I think everyone sort of vaguely understands that maybe in some abstract way, um, light is supposed to be not correct. However, watching Death Note, despite the fact that okay, to be clear, I know I can be a little bit of like a killjoy, especially on Twitter. I guess not recently because I haven't been tweeting a lot about anime, but I can be a bit of a killjoy when I look at an anime and I'm like, yeah, this is kind of it's propaganda, it's like racism, whatever, blah blah blah. So I want to be clear that if you watch Death Note from beginning to end, it is very stupid and it's very fun. Okay, those things are
Yes,
like
I think we can
indisputable.
all agree with that. Yes, it is very. It's funny because it's the stupidest show, but it also simultaneously makes you think to yourself, "I am very smart. I
Yeah,
understand that weird plot convoluted thing that just happened. I must be so smart. I'm going to go watch Rick and Morty now."
yes, exactly. Um, but if you actually like sit and like think about like the assumptions that are made, right? Like there's this one line that I still remember, even though it's been a while since I watched it, where the cops mention how like after Kira has started killing criminals, like uh, the world is slowly becoming like a better place, right? Like criminals are committing less crimes, less people are getting hurt. Nobody actually cares about the people that are like dying in the prisons, right? They're just kind of like there's sort of like a tacit agreement that like even though Kira is doing what everyone wants to do, and even though the
Mm.
world is being made a better place, it's still bad because I guess just killing people is bad. That's unfortunate. Like it's just like not good enough, right? Because first of all, just like killing every criminal does not solve crime because that's not why crime happens. Crime doesn't happen because we aren't punishing people enough, right? Crime happens for a number of reasons. There's like socioeconomic reasons, income inequality, the fact that our society like creates abusers that don't get held accountable until it's too late, right? Like all of these like underlying things need to be addressed if you actually want a world with less violence in it, right? Just like treating people who become violent as like aberrations that just need to be killed is like, I mean, we already do that, right? Well, like, what more evidence do you need? We already do that, and there's still crime. Like the world that Death Note is imagining, we live in it, and it fucking sucks, right? So yeah, it's just those like hidden, those like core assumptions that you need to think about when you watch a show. That I mean, it'll make it more interesting. It makes it more interesting for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think like the this sort of like structure, right? Like the structure of Death Note kind of sort of like pushes the viewer. And I think like a lot of anime in general, but I think it's important to kind of think about it with Death Note because Death Note is sort of like, okay, we have, this protagonist who um we are supposed to root for, not supposed to root for this right, because like this is the main character, this is the character who we are supposed to follow throughout the show, and if we at any level enjoy the show, then we have to kind of almost like cheer for the survival of this like kind of morally like obscene character, right, in Light.
Mm-hmm.
And L but on the flip side, right, we have L, who is right in a story construction sense an antagonist, right? He is like he impedes, right, Light's progress, right? He's supposed to like work to impede Light's progress, and right, Light is a cop, right, like for all
Right.
intents and purposes, like he's a cop.
Hmm.
So we are supposed to, on one hand we are supposed to be like, okay, like we're kind of supposed to like root against Light because we want the story to continue because maybe we enjoy the story, but on the other hand, L is a right symbol of this kind of like justice, and we're supposed to root for him because he is justice and because he is a cop and because he's kind of taking things into his own hands in the ways that like cops do, right, often. So it's I think the show, in some ways, the show is really useful in kind of seeing how, even just with like the construction of the story, we see like propaganda, right, as sort of like, well, we're supposed to root for L because he's, quote unquote justice, and because he's the.
You mean we're supposed to root for Light
Oh
or
yeah,
L?
well, I mean, it's even
It's
now, like
probably
I'm
a
just
little
like
bit of
it's
both, right?
complicated, right? I think we're
Hmm.
supposed to root for Light in the sense of the story construction, in the way that like he is a protagonist and we're supposed to root for him because we want the story to continue. But on the other hand, we're supposed to root for L because L is justice and
Oh,
L is
okay.
a
Now I
cop
understand.
and propaganda, right? So there's this kind of like interesting
There we
thing that
go.
kind of like occurs where at once L is an antagonist, right? But in reality, like we're rooting for the antagonist. We're rooting for like the cop, right, or the cop that takes things into his own hands. So it's it's interesting in a certain way. I mean, like I guess for me, the way I'm thinking through it now, but that's kind of how I sort of see things, and it's kind of how Death Note works, and how it sort of affects our views on cops, on like vigilantism, in the sense of like like alt right and conservatives and things like that, and cops.
I also think it's interesting because it's like whose voice is left in and whose voice is left out. Like,
Mm,
right, we never get the perspective of like you gotta imagine the people who are incarcerated when this is happening. Probably they're not having a fun time. Like
right.
they're just sitting there watching their cellmate like get murdered by this rando, and you're like, well,
Right.
that's gonna be me next. Which is interesting. I think we're gonna get to because I think there's also a parallel. I think between if I can transition a little bit, I think there's a parallel between Light and Makima from Chainsaw Man,
Mm,
right? Makima, right? There's this one very important episode where the first moment that we really get an indication that Makima is truly evil.
Hmm.
And I'm sure our listeners are very familiar with Chainsaw Man. I hope. If you aren't, go watch it. It's good. Or read it. The manga is better than the anime, in my opinion. The first real indication that we get that Makima is not a good person, she takes a bunch of prisoners who I don't remember if they're on death row or have life sentences, and she like just straight up kills them as sacrifices so that she can kill her enemies essentially.
Right.
And so the first time that we see her like as evil is when we were seeing her act as an instrument of state violence, right? So from the beginning in Chainsaw Man, we are encouraged to see the person who will, I don't think this is a spoiler, become the antagonist of the show. aligned with state violence, and that being the thing that makes them terrifying.
Mhm.
Mm.
And it's similarly extrajudicial as Light, but because she's not technically a cop, she's part of public safety, but she's still an agent of the state, right?
Mm.
Right.
So it's very interesting to kind of think about how I think Chainsaw Man takes a character who is in some ways really similar to Light and makes them like the villain of the show.
But a core distinction between Chainsaw Man and Death Note is that although I will definitely agree that like Light and Makima are in a lot of ways very similar. Chainsaw Man tends to, at least in part one, part two is very fun but also very weird, and I'm not sure what to make of it yet. But part one, Chainsaw Man tends to align its villains like with the state. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Death Note, Light in this case he's a protagonist, but he's a villain. He's aligned against the state, right?
Mm.
Because I think Chainsaw Man, I when I wrote about it, I argued that like Chainsaw Man has like a really good understanding of domination and hierarchy, and a really good understanding of like a lot of the problems with like investing so much investing so much like power in a state.
So yeah, Chainsaw Man is really interesting because it is clearly aligned. It has this deep understanding of state violence, and I think it's pushing the audience to critique state violence and critique the culture of incarcerated people as disposable and as the monopoly of the state to enact violence as being justified. Like, there's even one episode where Makima just straight up says, like, I don't think you understand that when you do violence, it is wrong because you are not with the state. But when I do violence, it is right because it is the state enacting this
Mm-hmm.
violence. I'm allowed to do whatever I want. So, another really interesting counter narrative of police in anime is Akudama Drive. Mo, you have a lot of thoughts about Akudama Drive.
Oh yeah. First of all, Akudama Drive, just in general in that season, it was like such a sleeper pick. I there's a if by any chance like Sophia is listening to this, he will he will get a good laugh out of this. But um, it's this like incredibly over the top, very bright, um, very like unique looking anime that feels silly at first when you watch the first episode. It's about um, essentially in the post-apocalyptic cyberpunk dystopia of Japan, where I want to get it right. It's the Kanto region and the Kansai regions, right? That sort of have this conflict. Um,
Yes.
right. And so Kansai is basically a vassal state of Kanto. And it's after a war that looks a lot like World War II and the subsequent bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Kanto basically imposes like this police state where the police have the power to designate anyone they want as an akudama, and they impose all kinds of ridiculous punishments. Um, and the story is basically about these people who yes have committed pretty violent crimes. I think that's one of the things I like about Akudama Drive so much is that like it doesn't shy away from the fact that like the protagonists that you're following are violent people and they have done bad things. But the show says, regardless of that fact, it's still wrong for the state to treat criminals this way. And I think that's really, really hard because it's very easy to find like someone who was like wrongly convicted or who had a conviction that was like widely disproportionate to what they did and say, look at this innocent person that we've hurt. It's a lot harder to say like, even if the people are kind of garbage in this way, what does it say about the system that still treats them as badly as they do, right? Um, so yeah. Anyway, it ends like there's like a riot and like the police tower falls and it's so amazing and incredibly funny. I would highly recommend if you're looking for I would recommend watching it alongside like thinking about abolition because I think if abolition is on your mind, like the show will it will really like hit.
Yeah, I would say I think one thing also is like um Yeah, it is fantastic. And also the when we're thinking about sort of like shows that either act as counter narratives or propaganda, right? If we think about, the thing with Death Note, and what I was talking about earlier, I think the thing that makes Death Note kind of like infuriating is that I think people have a really difficult time uh, seeing Death Note as like explicitly like propaganda, right? And the ways in which the story is constructed kind of like makes it difficult in terms of like the ways in which Ellen Light are juxtaposed, the ways in which the characters make particular decisions, and there are other characters that are morally this or morally that or whatever. But with Akudama Drive, it's like you're rooting for these people, right? It's like there's no like I would be hard pressed to find someone who's like not rooting for the criminals, right? Like who is watching Akudama Drive and is like, yeah, get them. Like you know what I mean? Like so I think that's
Akudama
something
Drive
that
has like a very clear cut sense of like right and wrong.
yeah.
And I appreciate that so much in an anime. I think the hot take of the day is that morally gray stories are super overrated. I think it's very easy to be morally gray because all situations are complicated and all situations have nuance.
Mm.
It is a lot difficult. It is a lot more difficult to look through that nuance and still say this is what I believe in, like this is what is right and this is what is wrong, right?
Yeah, and I think that like to build on that, there's this really strong undercurrent in a lot of cyberpunk narratives, right? That I think Akudama Drive resists, and a lot of narratives in general, of this kind of postmodernist nihilism that's like, oh well, the world is getting so complex, it is impossible to like, discern what is right and what is meaningfully, how to actually meaningfully, be a morally good person. So and it's this very edgelord tendency, right? We see
Right.
in, whether it's Rick and Morty or whether it's like a lot of different cyberpunk anime, especially things like, I don't know, Techno Lies and Serial Experiments Lane, and just long story tradition of nihilism, right? But even in the thing about these dire circumstances, right? The thing that an abolitionist lens clarifies so much about these dire circumstances is that they exist for a reason, not because, oh, the world is terrible because it's terrible. No, the world is terrible because it has to be terrible for certain people, for those people to continue to be exploited
Mm-hmm.
and for their labor to continue to be used and for them to be kept in place in enclosure, right? As Sadia Hartman puts it.
Mm-hmm.
And what Akadama Drive really says is like, no, we have to refuse that, right? We have to,
Right.
this circumstance must be destroyed, right? And it is unapologetic about that. And it's hard for me to see Akudama Drive as being anything like its message as being anything other than an anarchist message. Just, even if the state is stable, it is stable because it is insanely violent and must be brought down, right?
And kind of thinking about like so there are a couple things that this conversation is really sparking for me, and just to say, I really love this conversation that we're having. I'm like, yeah, I know we're talking about like it's like very serious, like and understand that, but also like I'm very happy to be talking about this with y'all because it's like you know um but the first thing that I'm thinking about is like this character Swindler as someone who distinctly not criminal, right? Within the sort of ways in which I guess in our reality we think of like criminal, right? That term. But as the show goes on, really embraces that, and the show
Yes.
like presenting that as like a positive thing, right? This idea of like fugitivity of like not criminality in the ways it becomes a bit like the ways in which fighting against the state, fighting against the police, right? As these state apparatuses. And one thing it kind of made me think about is like there's a scholar Fred Moten
Yes.
who writes about this idea of like called the undercommons and fugitive study. And Moten is talking about working against the oppressive violence, or like right of the university, and sort of showing that like there is a way to work against that in fugitive study. That's kind of like the terminology that it uses, right? And I think like Akudama Drive kind of makes me sort of like think about that like, yeah, like there's this like massive, there's a state and there's a police and there's state violence and there's like this institution, and like, you know almost like, right, to be a fugitive is at least one step in the right direction, right? When we're thinking about abolition, when we're thinking about the abolition of the state, or the abolition of the police, or these like oppressive state apparatuses. Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify. So like Swindler, her whole deal is she's basically like paying for street food, um, and she basically accidentally like doesn't pay it, like costs like 5 yen, and because of that, even though it was a misunderstanding and like the vendor didn't care, like the the state labels her as a criminal, right?
Mm.
And I think what I love about the show, and it speaks to what you were saying, is that because she was labeled as a criminal, she had to do criminal things, right? Just to like survive,
Mm, mm, mm,
right?
mm, mm.
She had
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
to build on her like criminal record, right? Where if we didn't have a state basically ostracizing people to enforce like a rigid system, then like she probably would not have done any of the other things that she did.
Right. And I think that like I often talk about with my students when I'm trying to explain to them like this idea of transformative justice and like why policing is ineffective as it responds to harm. Prisons are criminogenic, right? They create crime both within them and without them because they create a
Right.
circumstance in which a child does not have a father because the father's in prison. So then what does that child have to do to survive? You know,
Mm.
it creates a circumstance in which, there is a person who in the prison, maybe they're a trans woman, maybe they're like, one of the less, you know, able to defend themselves prisoners who is going to be raped. There are so many different ways in which prisons and police actually create more violence, both in themselves being violent, right, in state violence, and also in like inflaming all of the different root causes of violence. I think Akudama Drive really clearly demonstrates that.
What I love about Akudama Drive is that despite how like silly and over the top it is, it has like a really good understanding of like why criminality exists
Mm.
in a system like ours, right? And I think to contrast that again to a show like My Hero Academia, very classic and well known and well watched anime. Um, My Hero Academia, it's all about like heroes and villains, and it follows the story of like these high schoolers who go to like the best superhero academy uh, in the country, and they want to become professional superheroes, right? Um, and that show is essentially, I'm trying to summarize everything I wrote about it, but the TLDR is that it has no idea why criminals exist. It sort of thinks that they exist because some people are perverts who find it fun to like hurt people, and like that's just like what it is. Um and so it sort of posits that you need like symbols like All Might, which is like the Superman allegory of the world, to stand there as a symbol to remind criminals that if they ever step out of line and do what's in their nature, they will be punished, right? And the big central conflict of the show is that like All Might is basically no longer able to do that duty, and because of that, the criminals come out of the woodwork and they start acting in their nature, which is to just hurt people for no reason. And if you contrast, it's just like such a shallow, I think, analysis of why things happen, and it's shallow in such a way that enables, right? Like this is like the type of philosophy that like justifies like why we have police and prisons in the first place, right? Anyone who any like blue lives matter, thin blue line person will think the exact same thing, right? That some people are just bad, some people are just criminals, and they pour money into the very system into the very systems that create those criminals and create those conditions that make the problem worse, right?
One thing, yeah, like the ways in which like the the heroes, right? Like if you know, if we think about abolition, in relation to My Hero, we can see, right, the heroes as like, you know, what, like they're cops, like they're also cops. But I think one thing that My Hero sort of tries to do very like in a very flimsy sort of way, and I think so and other shows, I'm just trying to think of like maybe other shows that do that too, but like it sort of says, well, the heroes aren't cops because we have cops in the show. Like, look, the cops are over there. Like, they're cops. Like, you know, talk about them. Talk about those cops. Like, but I think one thing that I think these shows are useful for, and it's, which right is not to say that like the shows are good or anything like that, but it's to say that like these texts are useful to sort of showcase how there's a way in which we view like the agent, right, the agent of the state in terms of like the police or the
Right.
cop, or as oh, this person has to have a badge and they have to have a serial number and they have to have, you know, a pension, and there has to be like a unit and like this is how we like define like someone who is the police, right? But that's not right, like it's more than that. And
We're
I
talking
think,
about like the role, right?
yeah,
The
right.
societal role. Like even like in My Hero Academia, all the heroes are like they're they're technically like employees of like private companies, right? Which is definitely worse. That's definitely worse. But like yeah, they're like not literally cops in the legal definition, but they're cops in that they do the things that cops do, and you are supposed to look at them as if you would look at a police officer.
Right. And I often think about like in any situation, right? I often think that the definition of a cop in my book in a state like is the person who has the monopoly on violence, right? The person who is allowed
Mm,
to be violent without ever being held accountable to it, you know? And allowed to incarcerate and arrest, right? If you have that power, if you have the power to harm and there's no accountability and no like and it is viewed as morally justified, then bingo, you are probably a cop. Um, like and I think like Makima like pretty clearly lays that out when she says like in Chainsaw Man, she says like, yeah, you don't understand. Your violence is bad. I'm with the state. My violence is good. And that's how you know Makima is a cop, right?
mm,
And it is interesting because Chainsaw Man very clearly portrays Makima, right? And as the devils are not even necessarily the enemy in Chainsaw Man. That becomes more clarified in Chainsaw Man when Makima lays out like what the role, for example, of the gun devil is towards the end of Chainsaw Man 1. And spoiler alert for Chainsaw Man. If you haven't read the end of part 1, I'm going to spoil it a bit. We'll put it in the podcast notes when the ends of the spoilers are. Yeah, so you've been warned. But it's really interesting that the gun devil is revealed to actually already not be in existence as itself. It's become kind of this like almost like atomic weapon, weapon of mass destruction like weapon for the state to use for violence. And the goal of the state is not to get rid of the gun devil, but to repurpose it for more state violence, right? The goal has
Right.
no interest
mm.
in the safety of its citizenry. It only has interest in its own power, right? And maintaining its own power. Because if it actually believed in, keeping people safe, it would destroy that thing. That thing's bad,
It's
you
super
know?
dangerous. It kills so many people.
Yeah.
Just a countless number.
I think that like Chainsaw Man has this very deep understanding of how police and prisons and state violence operates, to maintain the kind of the stability of the state rather and of capitalism rather than to actually keep people safe in any meaningful way. With that, I think that we're going to wrap up our the part 1 of the discussion. We've introduced you to the basic ideas of abolitionism. We've talked about how we came to it. We've, gone into the main big grounding demand of abolitionism. It's great for part one. Now, in part two, we hope you come back for part two, where we're going to go much more in depth about some of the more complex aspects and some of the more debated aspects of abolitionism, such as centering survivors, talking about abolition and revolutionary transformation of the state, and dismantling anti-blackness. And we'll be talking about anime like Woman Called Fujiko Mine, JoJo Stone Ocean, Decadence, Michiko and Hajin. So we really hope that you come back for that in a couple weeks. And with that, we hope you join us for part two. Bye, everybody.